The doomsday clock shows how close we are to the apocalypse, a global catastrophe. It's a project run by a group called the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Changes to the clock are decided by several experts, including 18 Nobel Prize winners. The clock is currently set to 2 minutes before midnight, meaning that the risk of thermonuclear war is very high. The alarm signal has so far only been heard during practice alerts. Tomorrow, though, it might announce the start of a nuclear war. The last time the clock showed a time so close to midnight was in an epoch that seems to have remained in the distant past, 1953. In the 1980s, hundreds of people took to the streets with the slogan, "Kill the bomb, save people." Then the Cold War was over. Nuclear arsenals were reduced and people's minds put to rest. In the euphoria that followed the end of the Cold War, the world lost its fear and understanding of the consequences of a nuclear conflict. The findings of the Security Radar 2019 public opinion poll in 7 European countries, Germany, France, Latvia, Poland, Serbia, Russia and Ukraine, published in Germany by Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, show that the Germans and French are more concerned about climate change than nuclear war. It appears that nobody believes in the possibility of such a conflict. Academic Arbatov is director of the Center for International Security at the Institute of World Economy and International Relations, formerly a State Duma deputy and vice chairman of the State Duma Defense Committee. For 30 years we've lived without that fear. First, nuclear arsenals were radically reduced, largely due to Russia and the United States, but also some other countries. Over the last 30 years, they became about 10 times less, quantitatively, and about 30 times less in aggregate destruction potential. That is, as the specialists say, megatonnage. They're still very large, but awareness of that reduction has transformed worldwide public thinking into the impression that they've almost disappeared, just ceased to be. They've reduced, well, what of it? They've become quite out of place on the international security agenda with terrorism, migration, economic problems, environment and climate and nuclear proliferation brought to the fore. Horizontal proliferation caused anxiety during the Cold War and during the last 30 years, especially considering the nuclear power status that India, Pakistan and North Korea acquired. Iran came close to possessing nuclear weapons but then retreated. I'm not quite clear whether it will again move onto the threshold, but what largely caused concern was the complication of the situation, the appearance of new nuclear states, while the fear of a major war, always associated with the Soviet Union and the United States, Russia and the United States, which had actually accumulated huge nuclear arsenals. That fear has gone. General Vladimir Dvorkin, Doctor of Engineering Science, headed the Ministry of Defense 4th Central Scientific Research Institute, a think tank for the Strategic Missile Forces, the developer of nuclear missile weapons. The popular explanation is that state leaders and propaganda are responsible. Former leaders such as Khrushchev and Brezhnev, who saw the war, that mess, or Eisenhower. I read somewhere that just during training for the Normandy landing, 800 of his soldiers died. That was the price, and a very typical price. So those leaders remembered the war, and in no way wanted a new war, while present-day leaders haven't had that experience and apparently carelessly read and badly understand what's been written and said about the war. I think that's a very important point. Another point, we now have a great many experts, they're a dime a dozen, with academic titles and so on, who say that each side now has 10 times fewer nuclear weapons. Before, each of the parties had 12,000 warheads, while now, 1,500. And generally, a nuclear war is not so very dangerous. There will be no nuclear winter, and if there is, they're not as bad as it was considered to be. And a non-nuclear attack should continue to be deterred by the threat of a nuclear strike. So these arguments, taken together, really work. The Levada Center, the most reliable Russian sociological service, found that in 1989, 1 in 3 people feared worldwide disaster, while in 2017, fewer than 1 in 10 did. There is no fear of war. People are likely to get used to the fact that, due to the deterrence policies, there have been no major global conventional wars for decades, so they put their minds at rest. Or, as Vyacheslav Kantor put it, that's the banalization of the threat of nuclear catastrophe. The rhetoric from political leaders has changed. They no longer talk of arms control, but gladly present their voters with the achievements of the military-industrial complex. Direct threats to use nuclear weapons can be heard, meaning that politicians are confident that such a war could be won, while coming off unharmed. New generations of politicians, journalists, public, parliamentarians and parliaments replaced the old. New people have emerged who, over the last 30 years, became central figures in their respective areas. They don't remember the Cold War period, to say nothing of the Second World War, which few now remember. Old leaders, Soviet and American, did remember it. Many of them saw the war, while present-day leaders did not live through it and do not remember the war, and only know about it from films and books. In fact, they don't remember or know about the Cold War either. People who were relatively young, 20 to 40 in the Cold War years, they remember if it was their professional occupation, like me, for instance. Therefore, I know and remember and often write and talk about it. But people who were not directly engaged in it, even people of my age, present-day MPs, executive officials, military leaders, they were too young then and don't even remember the Cold War. Some people understand that it's impossible, but assert it with quite clear and varied aims in mind. Others truly don't understand, don't know all the facts, the reasons, and therefore they might do anything at all. To varying degrees, insanity is intrinsic to many political forces and many population groups. The only disturbing detail seems to be the prospect of pariah states or terrorist organizations having access to nuclear weapons. Former US President Barack Obama said that a nuclear weapon being in the hands of terrorists was the most immediate and extreme threat to global security. A CBS News poll showed that 72% of Americans felt uneasy about the possibility of conflict with North Korea. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs confirms that 75% of Americans see North Korea's nuclear program as a critical threat facing the United States, and fear North Korea's bomb in the hands of the new great leader, Kim Jong-un. I suspect that Kim Jong-un is well aware that if he, God forbid, launched even one missile with a warhead, then his regime would be swept off the face of the earth. After all, he's an educated man, knows something, made friends with Trump. I think that the probability of trouble from there is very low. A new Rasmussen poll based on a national telephone and online survey found that 57% of respondents believe that because of North Korea, the threat of a nuclear war will exist until the end of the 21st century, while only 32% think that nuclear war is unlikely in the next 80 years or so. We look back at the dramatic Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when leaders in the West and East managed to avoid a war at the last moment, and we believe that if the world was again on the brink of war, our leaders would stop in good time and that common sense would prevail. Now, though, it's Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un who are playing the nuclear game. For President Trump and his aides, agreements on arms limitation and reduction are a Lilliputian attempt to chain the American Gulliver. They are convinced that they have to defend their people through military might, not with slips of paper. In other words, has the value of nuclear weapons only gone up in the eyes of politicians and heads of state? Perhaps politicians do believe that a nuclear war can be won. No, I don't think politicians from leading countries, political leaders, do believe it. At least Putin, speaking about launching under attack, has recently said repeatedly that it would be global catastrophe and all would perish, but we'd be in heaven. While our enemies, well, he didn't say hell, but it seems to follow that they'd be in hell. Incidentally, I think it unsafe to use religious discourse here, as then the catastrophe itself would not seem so very dramatic. Hopefully that was said in a fit of temper or for the sake of a witty remark, and his words that a nuclear war would be a catastrophe for civilization and probably for the planet, evidence that he actually understands it. As for President Trump, I'm not sure whether he understands or not, but I hope he's surrounded by experts who have explained the potential effects to him. The UK, France and China, most likely they understand too. India understands. As for Pakistan, I have great doubts, but these are countries that don't affect the probability of global nuclear war. As for the military, again, civil and military reasoning is different. For civilian leaders, politicians, victory makes sense only if it's based on informed assessment. Suppose our state was able to restore itself some 10 to 20 years after a nuclear exchange. Then, if they're told that our losses would be at such and such a level, but no higher, then it would mean something to them. For the military, though, to them, victory is an operational commitment. To respond with a devastating retaliation, that's a victory, as the mission has been carried out. What happens to your country is no business of theirs, nor their casualty count. It's the potential enemy's count. To assess whether it is or is not a victory, or a Pyrrhic victory, or a catastrophe, is the responsibility of political leadership. Mutual suicide? Can that be considered a victory? For politicians, most probably it can't. For the military, if they performed the mission, it is a victory. History shows that arms races make the world unsafe, but few people warn us of that. The International Luxembourg Forum on Preventing Nuclear Catastrophe has existed for more than 10 years now, thanks to the efforts of its president, the philanthropist and prominent public figure, Vyacheslav Kantor. He managed to bring together the efforts of major world experts in the field of non-proliferation of nuclear arms and arms reduction and limitation. Former defense and foreign affairs ministers, international organization heads, generals and academics. Perhaps there is no other world-class organization that could so openly discuss at such a high intellectual level the nuclear catastrophe danger that hangs over us. In this program, we will ask those experts the big question: why do we no longer fear nuclear weapons? And where could that lead? For people who lived in the Cold War period, nuclear weapons were something real and tangible. There were nuclear weapon test sites, live tests, underground, in the air, in the atmosphere, even in space, let alone underwater. People saw that it was a monstrous weapon. Arsenals were stockpiled. Nuclear armed forces stood in opposition to each other. The fear was great, and nuclear weapons were a fact, not an abstraction as they are now. In people's minds, they are an abstraction, while in real life they're a fact. Although again, the reduction has been considerable in the last 30 years. However, considering huge potentials accumulated by the end of the 1980s, even taking into account all such reductions, the arsenals are still huge. I don't want to burden you with figures, but while by the end of the 1980s the arsenals of largely the Soviet Union and the United States, but other countries too, were equal to about 1 million Hiroshimas, now about 78,000 Hiroshimas remain. That, as you can see if you remember those horrifying pictures, is still too much. But in people's minds, due to those considerable reductions, they are almost non-existent. New generations have come. The 30 years of relaxation when other problems were seen as priorities, these problems seemed to disappear in their minds. Therefore, we're now witnessing a literal outburst of irresponsible, reckless speculations about the use of nuclear weapons, that nuclear weapons guarantee security, and in addition are an efficient instrument of foreign and even military policy. That is, that they can be used, and there's nothing tragic about it. The confrontation between Russia and the United States poses a serious threat. The old way of thinking, hatred for the outside world, the determination to fence off by establishing a wall of nuclear missiles, the search for enemies within and without, has again gained the upper hand. Current political and ideological establishments have a vested interest in aggravating confrontation and the military-industrial complex, in essence, an arms race. Again, President Putin announced that we were developing an intercontinental cruise missile with an atomic engine and nuclear re-entry vehicle. Nearly nothing is known about it. There were similar attempts before by the Americans too, but they all failed. Well, this brings up the question: if you've made such compact atomic engines that they can be installed in a cruise missile, then put them in bombers. They could be on air patrol duty for a week, and you wouldn't have to worry about a disarming strike. Where is the good of a cruise missile that would take a week to reach the enemy at an intercontinental distance with an atomic engine like that? Much of what's done in the military sphere is wide open to criticism in terms of common sense and systems analysis. Take Poseidon, a super torpedo so much admired and praised by all kinds of aggressively minded military and civil experts and public opinion. The political leadership seems enthusiastic about it. What's it for? What can it do that can't be done with 1,500 nuclear warheads in strategic forces? Attack an enemy's coastal centers? They can't be destroyed by a torpedo, but by a ballistic missile in 15 minutes. All the more so as Americans have ground-based missiles in the center of the continent, Air fleet in the air, submarines at sea, state leadership too in the middle of the continent or in airborne command posts. Such a torpedo can do nothing to them. It can destroy a coast or generate a tsunami wave to wash out the radioactive ruins after a previous nuclear exchange. They are quite useless. I've never seen any comprehensible substantiation. It's wizardry in search of a barely understandable objective. The experience of military cooperation has also been forgotten. The United States rendered Russia a great service, not only in the elimination of nuclear weapons. Some say they did it for themselves. They did a great service and did it for us, rather than for themselves. But by the early to mid-1990s, we had about 100 submarines taken out of operational service. Due to lack of funds, they weren't dismantled, and the atomic reactors weren't removed. They took on water and sunk out in the North and Russian Far East, which was fraught with catastrophic consequences above these oceanic Chernobyls. Thanks to the assistance provided by the Nunn-Lugar program, by the early 2000s they had all been disposed of. Nuclear materials safely removed, new waste storage built that did not leak with every flood and didn't overflow with spring meltwater into the Barents Sea. Such an operation was unthinkable in the 1970s and 80s. But the present-day military has an indistinct memory of that, and no Cold War memory at all as a rule. They know about it from books, some memoirs, reminiscences, if they have an interest. Readiness to use arms is inherently dangerous. The launch if under attack strategy means launching missiles immediately after an enemy missile launch is detected by radar. However, early warning systems can go wrong, while a launched missile can't easily be called back, so the world could easily perish. If the political leadership is in crisis, heaven forbid, and the question comes up about the possibility of an armed conflict, then we'll be on the edge again. The political leadership will be provided with operational plans developed in advance, with no possibility of improvisation. They will have to act in accordance with the plans drawn up for them by the General Staff Main Operational Group and use weapons manufactured by the production sector and supplied to the troops. As often as not, they will face a dilemma, whether to start a war or to miss the first strike and perish with an unclear ability to retaliate. Why launch under attack? Let's go back to that question. Recently, President Putin has repeatedly said and explained what a retaliatory strike was. Satellites locate, radar revalidates, and we launch all our systems without waiting for enemy warhead impact. We will only have a few minutes to make a decision. But in an actual crisis, a mise-en-scene is not as good as being at the Ministry of Defense table when diagrams are shown, or Central Command launch control facilities are visited. There, everything is shown on the screens, and units and forces report their missile launches. However, in real life it's different. There's a lack of adequate information, total uncertainty about what the enemy is doing and why. Why is it sending its submarines out to sea? Why did its bombers take off? In preparation for a first strike? Or is it to ensure survival in the event of our first strike? And actually, decisions will be taken based on military situation reports, often with a great degree of uncertainty and lack of information. And the dilemma will be an either-or question. Either use nuclear arms or perish. Here, I see an immense danger in the situation that remains, even now, with reduced quantities of such weapons. Cyber weapon systems are increasingly being developed, with any result possible, even if the probability of error is low. In any case, so many human lives should not depend on arbitrary probability. All the more so as there is no need for such an immediate response which has no deterrent value. Before, we and the Soviet Union had 1,398 fixed launchers, and as the precision of US missiles improved, a threat that the US could behead us by a sudden disarming strike increased. At that time, such a possibility was considered. The well-known academic Savin, hero of socialist labor, a developer of space-based warning systems, we used to discuss these problems with him, as he said we should immediately launch our missiles as soon as we see that they, US missiles, are flying, immediately. However, there were men of sense who, following the improvement of US missile precision, started to develop and deploy mobile missile systems with increased ability to survive after a disarming strike. They are much more costly than fixed launchers because of their structure, operational system, maintenance of readiness for action, protective cover and maneuvering. We began to develop and introduce mobile ground toppoles and railway missile systems. That helped us avoid likely errors upon launching an immediate strike, because it worked as a deterrent factor as well. Our potential enemy, that is the US, was well aware that we would have substantial potential for a retaliatory blow that would destroy them too. These factors worked then and are working now. Still less do we need a momentary launch, as we now have better submarines and Yars mobile systems with an increased ability to survive. Our overseas counterpartner knows about it and would never risk anything reckless. Political leaders need much more time for such decision-making, not 4 or 5 minutes. There should be sufficient time, and for that you will need other forces. Rather than launching under attack when you either launch or lose every missile, and it's unclear whether or not you'll be able to retaliate. Therefore, there should be forces with increased ability to survive. And political leaders should be able to take decisions in airborne command posts or underground bunkers. That is, everything should be planned in advance, not in the hope that everything will work well and within several minutes it will be clear whether it's peace or war. No doomsday decisions should be taken. Films about the dangers of nuclear weapons are no longer screened. Both the United States, Russia, and other countries say that the concept of a nuclear winter, a catastrophe that would inevitably follow the use of weapons of mass destruction, is a chiller story, a global hoax, and a politically motivated falsification. There would be no nuclear winter or scorched earth. Humanity would not perish and life would continue. As a result of this mass suggestion seance, society has lost its fear of the disastrous consequences of a nuclear war. We just cannot imagine what a nuclear explosion would do. It is something irrational, inhuman. The summary effect, the heat flash, blast wave, seismic waves, all make an impression of something inconceivable, something beyond comprehension. It becomes immediately clear that this should never take place. Vladimir Putin said that now the efficiency and precision of conventional non-nuclear weapons has drawn close to that of nuclear weapons. Only a person who has never seen or heard or imagined what it was like could say that. There can be no comparison or even anything near it. I know all the nuclear explosion parameters, X radiation, gamma rays, neutron flux. I know the distance of the blast effect from nuclear explosions of varying yields. I can say conclusively that there can be no drawing closer of nuclear explosion factors and conventional non-nuclear weapons. The military always presumed that they would emerge victorious from any war, even a nuclear one. This could have been alleged at the start of the Cold War and nuclear confrontation. Look, they have plans for striking a blow against the Soviet Union, drop shots and so on, as if they don't understand that we too had such plans. No one mentions it, but command staff are always working. They have plans for all eventualities. But there, such plans get into the press, while here, it's still a strictly closed subject. If they have nuclear weapons, they're prepared to use them. They have relevant operational plans and relevant targets. A nuclear weapon is not a tank or a machine gun. No improvisation is possible. Their use is planned in advance, often as first use, first strike, especially for tactical nuclear weapons and even strategic nuclear weapons. But the military always have a regular excuse. We don't make decisions on using these weapons. That's for the politicians. If they decide to use them, we will obey. We're obliged to. We're prepared for it. We manufacture these weapons, that is, industrial corporations produce them, and we operate, maintain, and prepare ourselves to use them, but we're not responsible. If political leaders give the instruction, we will use the weapons. It's their responsibility. At the same time, both their experience and a new situation in which cooperation and security have again been replaced by confrontation make them, as they believe, seriously prepare for cataclysms likely to involve nuclear weapons. For them, they have also become an abstraction. No one has seen them. Maybe some veterans remain, but generally none of them has ever visited a firing ground, never seen or felt the tests, even underground ones, not to mention underwater or atmospheric tests. So for them, it's pretty much an abstraction, although they do have reasonable knowledge of the engineering element. Today too, don't we often hear that actually, as long as the situation and its effects are well judged, it would be possible to win a nuclear war? I have not heard it myself, though rumors about such utterances made behind the scenes in a closed circle have reached my ears. I don't know what can and what can't be believed, what's said in earnest and what's a bluff, what's said to intimidate the other party just in case, so they don't think that we would never under any circumstances use such weapons. Neither party has any doubts about using a retaliatory blow, but the question is whether a first strike, first use is possible. It is assumed in both our and the American military doctrines, officially assumed. Specifically, our doctrine states that Russia may deploy nuclear weapons first in retaliation for non-nuclear aggression, if it jeopardizes the very existence of the state. It does not specify how such weapons may be used, or the meaning of existence of the state. Understandably, these notions are very elastic and may be interpreted differently. However, based on this doctrinal provision, you can hypothesize about the possibility of first use of nuclear weapons, so that the other side won't think it could win a conventional war using its economic or military technological superiority. It is impossible to understand whether this is said in earnest or for deterrent posture. But when it's said in times of peace, generally I am disposed to put up with it. Such utterances are pronounced both here and there, within the framework of many decades of mutual nuclear deterrence philosophy. Each side is not mutually deterred. It deters the other side. And in sum total, it is mutual deterrence. Who could expect the Caribbean crisis and suggest that it would develop in the way that it did? Who could expect that the US Navy command that organized the blockade of Cuba would demand that President Kennedy and Defense Secretary McNamara permit warships to be put forward, beyond the operational radius of aircraft deployed in Cuba? To go forward meant to give Khrushchev several fewer days to decide whether to stop the ships or force through the blockade and run into an armed conflict. There were many stories like that. They prove that it's impossible to provide for every eventuality, and the only other thing that can be provided for is to develop such a doctrine, such operational plans, such forces and facilities that would not compel participants to take hurried, quick decisions that could be fatal. Even if only one power launched a nuclear strike using a small part of its nuclear potential and destroyed several cities, the majority of the world's population would soon die. Not through radiation, but due to unprecedented climate change and catastrophic global cooling. In the event of a nuclear exchange, a massive nuclear attack, God forbid, terribly, the main adversary's casualties would amount to tens and later hundreds of millions. Can that be considered a victory? If your country within a few hours loses 40 million people and the other side 80 million, is that a victory? To a civilian expert, an ordinary citizen and politician, it is by no means a victory. But to the military, perhaps it is. Civilian leaders, decision-makers who will have to authorize the use of nuclear weapons, may be aware of such estimates. They may presume that if we are the first to use, we have a chance of winning. Scientists know how the world rapidly cooled and killed off the dinosaurs after a massive meteorite strike. The nuclear winter effect is also compared to the Little Ice Age, a period of severe cooling in Europe that began in the 14th century. Studies show that even a limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan would destroy modern civilization, change the climate to a nuclear autumn, and lead to widespread crop failure. A limited war in southern Asia could trigger a famine for 2 billion people. In former times, the military chief of the General Staff, Marshal Sergei Akhrameyev, for example, were well aware of the fact. Sergei Akhrameyev wanted to remove all nuclear weapons from the Navy, except for strategic submarines, as there were mines, torpedoes, and air defense weapons. The chief of naval operations immediately bristled. In this case, if we remove nuclear weapons, we will be considerably weaker than the Americans. But Akhrameyev quickly responded, "How much weaker are you with nuclear weapons?" The naval operations chief opened his briefcase, fished out a paper and said, "Fivefold. I remember the figure well. And how much weaker will you be without nuclear weapons?" The chief fished out another paper and said, "Without nuclear weapons, sevenfold." Everyone there chortled mockingly. What difference does that make, Akhrameyev said. That's why I want them removed, to avoid trouble, such as losses, flooding and so on. I don't think that it was fear then, real fear in the usual sense of the word, but rather fear of incidents that could lead to escalation, a potential accidental firing of individual systems. But by that time, both we and the Americans already had such well-developed unauthorized launch and unauthorized access prevention systems that there could not even be the slightest signs of a potential breach of the systems. But can't our modern, sophisticated precision weapons that many people talk about destroy and actually disarm nuclear strike potential? This is pure myth, because when the panic spreads, moreover at a high level in the General Staff, they said, a disarming strike, a non-nuclear, disarming, precision cruise missile strike. The Americans have 6,000 such cruise missiles, and that's just at sea. And there are all the others too, non-nuclear. And they prohibit our retaliatory blow. They make a disarming strike, and even our military experts hit the ceiling. 2 or 3 times they've published in open publications their calculations showing that such a scenario was impossible, because for guaranteed destruction, different calculation methods may be used. Suppose cruise missiles might hit a silo launcher, with a probability of, say, 0.8 to 0.9. But for guaranteed destruction, 5 to 6 cruise missiles are required to bring the probability to almost 1. Otherwise, you'll get a retaliatory blow. As for the blow's space-time structure, it's impossible to deliver such a blow that would neutralize all missile launching areas in Russia, and I just mean the fixed launchers, let alone mobile launchers, whose positions will mostly be unknown. Therefore, both we and the Americans use these myths whose only aim is to terrify each other to death and secure additional appropriations. This widespread trick worked before, it's working now, and will work in the future too. What is a precision weapon? Presently, it's a long-range cruise missile and hypervelocity missile. I say satellites will locate them and then you'll see them exploding overhead. So what's to be done? To start a launch while under attack based on a satellite signal? But satellites give false alarms again and again. Radar hasn't given false alarms so far. There have been several unclear episodes, but satellites do occasionally do it. It's documented. There you are, a war. Not because of political decision-making made in an unclear situation based on plans developed in peacetime long before the crisis, but because, actually, it would be an auto-start. A satellite provides a signal. Missiles are launched. This is about the reality of hardware, automatic equipment, computers and so on. And simultaneously, anti-satellite weapons, cyber weapons are being developed that could deactivate those satellites. As for third parties, provocateurs or terrorists, they may, through cyber subversion, make a satellite provide false information. In a crisis, that means an exponentially increased danger. Meanwhile, by replacing your systems with systems that have a high ability to survive due to their location, you erase that problem. Ground mobile missile systems, airborne command posts where national leadership can be quickly transported, total protection centers, we have them, so deep and concrete enveloped that they cannot even be hit by nuclear weapons, not to mention any conventional weapon. There are large numbers of submarines on duty at sea where no precision weapon can hit them, and they can't be detected. Advanced aircraft readiness in a crisis. Aircraft are not missiles. They can be ordered to take off and then landed. They take off and watch from the air as long as is required. If it's a false alarm and after the danger has passed, they return to base, unlike ballistic missiles which can't be stopped once launched. A mass international anti-nuclear opinion, like the strong movement of 3 decades ago, no longer exists. People don't call on their governments to stop nuclear escalation. A new arms race has been launched. Billions are being spent on developing new delivery systems, bombs, missiles, as well as control and guidance systems. The Russian-US treaty on eliminating intermediate and short-range missiles is breaking down. Though it was hoped that over 6 months compromises would be reached and there were options that could have helped the leaders save political face. In this respect, I have an opinion I have long been voicing, that the treaty can be saved. If you feel like saving it, you can save it. If you don't feel like it, or if you're uncertain about it, it can't be saved. There are quite simple engineering solutions, reciprocal solutions. Unlike the Krasnoyarsk radar case, when we, in sackcloth and ashes, did all we were demanded to do, no, we may demand too, in Romania and Poland. Offensive missiles may be placed in launching systems. This is an intelligent guess. As on ships, they are placed in universal launching systems, both offensive and defensive missiles. Hence, we may demand that they prove that it's not the case. In the same way, they may demand that we prove that our missiles, which in their opinion have a strike range of more than 500 kilometers, are genuinely no more than 500 kilometers. Unlike generally accepted rules of law and legal culture, arms control does not provide for the presumption of innocence. No, if you're accused of violating the treaty, it's not the other party that should prove it. You must prove that you are not violating it. In this respect, they must prove that no offensive missiles are placed there or allow us at our option and at any time to visit, open the lid and check. Whilst we must prove to them that the missiles we showed in the hangar in January and which are 50 centimeters longer than the previous model, in respect of which no claims had been made, first have a strike range no more than 500 kilometers, and second, that the missiles deployed and based on Iskander units are the same as those shown in the hangar. Americans say, these are not the same missiles. They fool us again. These missiles are 50 centimeters longer, and those missiles are 2 meters longer. So we'll give them the opportunity to inspect any base at short notice and make sure that the missiles are of the right type. Absolute uncertainty about START 3, whether it will or will not be prolonged, whether there will be a new treaty, although I still hope. I know that consultations are underway about prolonging START 3 for 5 years. The Luxembourg Forum in each memorandum stresses the need to develop this area, preserve the treaty and go on to the next. Now, in Rome, we will propose a mandatory prolongation of the treaty, hoping that for 5 years, the leaders will mature and be smart to preserve the arms control system and conclude a new treaty. Our leaders did lots of silly things. 3 times Obama proposed a new treaty, the last one not long before he left office. An absolutely acceptable treaty that would reduce strategic nuclear weapons by 1/3. Our response was no. You have the ABM system, disarming strike by precision nuclear weapons, sanctions. How can we negotiate with you? If we had agreed then, there would be no problem now, and the treaty would be in effect for some 15 years without all the unnecessary fears and strains. Last year, when repudiation of the treaty became quite possible, our position was like this. We kind of need it, but won't make any special efforts to preserve it. Take it or leave it. We'll do without it. That's our attitude. But now we need the treaty more than 30 years ago, when it was negotiated, because the geostrategic situation is different. If the Americans deploy their missiles in Europe, they won't do it in the UK, Italy, Belgium or the Netherlands, but in Poland, Romania, perhaps the Baltic states. And the missiles will be different, with short flight times or unpredictable trajectories. Hypervelocity systems capable of causing much more damage than at the time of all that mess that resulted in the signing of the Great Treaty, the INF Treaty in 1987, which, to all intents and purposes, was much more beneficial for us than for the Americans then, and is 10 times more beneficial for us now. Each of our conferences, each round table results in a new memorandum which we put forward to the heads of all leading states, the UN Security Council, the IAEA, and other international organizations, and receive regular positive feedback and thanks. I believe it's a very important element of influence upon leaders' policies and thinking, which works for the good of humanity. It is especially important now that the strategic stability principles established over the decades of the existence of missile armament control systems are actually being broken down. Perhaps some agencies think that we don't need the treaty. We're surrounded by countries within strike range of their missiles. American anti-missile bases are being built around us. We have nothing to keep any NATO bases or facilities under attack where American reinforcements may be deployed from the US. Perhaps there are such attitudes. At any rate, they've been pronounced at the highest level over the last 10 years, up to last summer. Again and again at the highest levels of military and political leadership. Maybe such views still remain. Then anxiety began to be felt about how the situation would develop without the treaty. So some ideas might appear. I don't mean political leadership, but departmental attitudes. That we don't need the treaty so much. And if we're able to get rid of it by American hands, it would be especially good. Perhaps such an attitude does exist. They may report to chief decision makers, "We did our utmost, but the Americans don't want to agree. We can't do more." Who will bring these options to the top leaders' notice? I don't think that our leaders read articles in scientific reviews, which have been discussing them over the last 5 years. As for the Luxembourg Forum, I will talk about it, that the treaty can still be saved, that we have time until the 2nd of August, the official date of American withdrawal. In accordance with Article 15, they waited after giving notice. Now they can withdraw. The things I speak of may be agreed within 2 weeks, if there's the will. Sure, it would be no bed of roses for them either. They'd have to persuade the Poles and Romanians to provide access to our inspectors, open the lids and show. Why should we do that, they'd say. We're not violating any provisions. These are defensive systems. At any rate, unlike our State Duma, the US Congress started moving in that direction. A bill was tabled, named incidentally after Senators Luga and Ellen Tauscher deceased, who played an active part in negotiating the treaty and subsequent negotiations for Start 3 prolongation for 5 years. The movement for saving the INF treaty, though less intensive, was also launched in the US Congress. A session of the International Luxembourg Forum on Preventing Nuclear Catastrophe is opening in Rome. Our crew will go to the forum, and you will be among the first to hear the main ideas and proposals put forward by leading experts. I believe that the forum's utmost importance is connected with the membership of its supervisory board, which now consists of 15 members, all world-renowned figures who need no introduction. Henry Kissinger, former US Secretary of Defense William Perry, former UK Secretary of State for Defense Des Brown, former Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Secretary of the Security Council of Russia Igor Ivanov, former Russian Federation Ambassador to the United States Vladimir Lukin, former Directors General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and others. Generally speaking, over the 12 years of its existence, the Luxembourg Forum has put forward and discussed at the highest level a long list of ideas and provisions, which were then included in our documents disseminated to heads of leading powers and international organizations, such as NATO, the European Union, United Nations and IAEA, and such as the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which were later brought to life. The 2015 deal with Iran, the 2010 Start 3 Treaty, the Luxembourg Forum considerably contributed to all that. What made me happy is that in the last 4 years, the Luxembourg Forum put forward an idea boosted by other forum participants that now, at this distance of time, our interaction in this area shall be renewed with the acknowledgement of what had been declared earlier, that a nuclear war will have no winners and should not take place. Such declarations were signed in the 1970s and 80s. Then the issue was taken off the table. The theme we discussed at the beginning, a nuclear war should not take place. Now it may reappear. Information has leaked, officially unconfirmed, that preparing for the summit that did not take place last November, Russia sent Washington a proposal to sign such a joint declaration. The Americans turned down the proposal, which grieved me to the heart. But the rejoicing fact is that our officials accepted and sent the proposal. First, because it was the right thing to do. Second, because we'd been calling for it for the last 5 years, just as we have been trumpeting and clashing about the arms control system. First of all, nuclear arms control. No one would listen to us. Now it's widely understood and discussed at the highest level. This is the official channel of the International Luxembourg Forum on Preventing Nuclear Catastrophe, with a 3-part documentary, Why Do We Not Fear Nuclear War? Please watch and subscribe.